Here in lesson 2 of this chapter, we will look at the organic molecules in the human body and in our diet in a little more detail and see what the body uses them for, how they are acquired, and how they are metabolized. Okay, let's move on to organic compounds. So these are the ones that contain carbon and usually hydrogen and are present in living things. The first organic compound group we will consider are the carbohydrates. I don't know about you, but I love my carbs. They're not only found in your body, but also found in the foods we eat. Carbohydrates, being organic, contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and include such foods as sugars, glycogen, starches, and cellulose. We ingest these carbohydrates to get nutrients from them as well as energy. So the main function of the body, the main function of carbohydrates in the body is to capture the energy from the bonds within these food sources to make ATP. Now, while lipids and under extreme conditions, proteins can also be used to make energy, some cells can only use carbohydrates or have a limited capacity to use other nutrients with the exception of carbohydrates. So they are highly dependent on carbohydrates to make their ATP. And these are red blood cells, which transport oxygen to all the cells of your body, as well as neural cells or neurons. So the neurons that make up your nervous system are also highly dependent on carbohydrates. That is why when your blood sugar levels begin to drop, you feel lethargic, sometimes dizzy, unable to concentrate, and irritable. That is because your neurons are deprived of their carbohydrate nutrient. So your simple sugars, including monosaccharides and disaccharides, are considered carbohydrates. And then we have our larger polysaccharides, such as glycogen and starches, and cellulose. Besides being used to provide energy, carbohydrates can also be involved in structural or regulatory roles where they attach to other molecules such as proteins or lipids. So you may hear of glycolipids or glycoproteins in the membranes of cells that provide structural or regulatory communicating roles. Carbohydrates are divided into three major groups. The simplest, smallest unit are the monosaccharides, which are considered simple sugars. All carbohydrates that we ingest must be digested down into monosaccharides in order to be absorbed. So disaccharides, polysaccharides, all of them have to be broken down into monosaccharides to be absorbed. The three major monosaccharides that come from our food are glucose, fructose, and galactose. The disaccharides, or simple sugars, made up of two monosaccharides linked together by a covalent bond, are sucrose, lactose, and maltose. So if we go to the next few slides, you'll see what each of these are made up of. So let me just introduce them here, and then we'll look at their composition later on. But your disaccharides and your monosaccharides are simple sugars. Disaccharides only require one reaction to break the bond between the two sugar units in order to create the monosaccharides. So monosaccharides and disaccharides are easily digested or absorbed. Your polysaccharides are large complex carbohydrates that contain tens up to hundreds of monosaccharides joined together, usually single glucose units linked together in branching structures. And again, they are synthesized through dehydration synthesis reactions. So your polysaccharides are your starch from plant foods, glycogen from animal foods. That's how your animal tissues as well as our cells store glucose as the polysaccharide glycogen, as well as cellulose. Now, cellulose is unique in that we do not have enzymes that can break it down into the glucose units to be absorbed. So cellulose and other forms of fiber are undigestible. However, they are healthy and beneficial because they give you a sense of fullness so that you do not consume too many calories. Fiber also helps to ease the passage of food through your digestive tract and creates regular bowel movements. Fiber is also known to reduce the absorption of fats and cholesterol, and carbohydrates remove carcinogens or is associated with decreased carcinogens in the digestive tract. So a diet high in fiber reduces the risk of colon cancer. So go get your fiber. These diagrams show us the major monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose, as well as our three disaccharides, sucrose, lactose, and maltose. Please note that the formula for your monosaccharides is C6H12O6. And these atoms are arranged in hydrocarbon rings. Now, this molecule is relatively high in oxygen. So your simple sugars are quite soluble in water and hydrophilic because they are very polar. Monosaccharides are linked together in dehydration synthesis reactions by removing a water molecule across the bond to create covalent bonds that form disaccharides. So again, sucrose is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose, while lactose is a disaccharide of galactose and glucose, and maltose is a disaccharide of 2 glucose units. We also acquire another monosaccharide from our food called ribose, but note that ribose is a 5-carbon monosaccharide, and your body does not metabolize it for energy, but it is a major component of nucleic acids, deoxyribonucleic acid and ribose nucleic acid. Ribose is also the sugar component of your energy molecule, ATP. So interestingly, it is not broken down to acquire energy, but it is part of the energy molecule, ATP. Here we have an example of a polysaccharide, glycogen, which is the main storage form of glucose in animal tissue, specifically skeletal muscle, muscle tissue in general, as well as the liver. So each of these little shapes represents a glucose unit linked together by covalent bonds to other glucose units. This is a great table summarizing and organizing the carbohydrates. So not only do you need to know what each carbohydrate is made of and what type is it, monosaccharide, disaccharide, or polysaccharide, you also should know which type of food source provides which carbohydrate. So, sucrose, the disaccharide, is from plant foods, mainly fruits. That's where you get the fructose fruit from, monosaccharide, fructose sugar from. Okay, so sucrose comes from plant foods. Lactose is an animal disaccharide because it's found in milk and milk products. So galactose is an animal monosaccharide from the animal disaccharide lactose. And maltose, the 2 glucose units, is from grains. So plant foods, specifically grains like barley and wheat and malt. Your polysaccharides include glycogen, which again is the storage form of carbohydrates in animals. And we get this from muscle tissue or meat, as well as the liver. The starch is the storage form of carbohydrates in plants and is also the main carbohydrate in your foods. Cellulose, which is also from plants, and other forms of fiber, again, cannot be digested but aid in the movement of food through the intestine, so they're very good for you. Now, carbohydrates should represent 50% of your calories, and that 50% should be high in polysaccharides and highest in fiber. Okay, so it helps to manage weight and provides other health benefits. Simple sugars that you find in your baked goods and your sugar for your tea or your coffee or your fancy drink from Starbucks, yeah, they taste good, but they're not good for you, because as your body absorbs these sugars quickly, your body then releases the hormone insulin to regulate its levels, and that promotes the uptake of these sugars into your cells and storage. And when in excess, they are converted into fats, and we have an unlimited capacity to store fat. So the carbohydrates are first absorbed and used to make ATP as necessary by the cells. Any excess is taken up by the liver and skeletal muscles and stored as glycogen. And once the glycogen stores have been maximized, excess carbohydrates are converted into fat. And friends, we have an unlimited capacity to store fat in our bodies. So mind your carbs. They're good for you. Your body needs them for energy, but be aware of the types of carbohydrates you are ingesting. The second major organic group we will consider are the lipids. And this is a rather large and somewhat diverse group. Lipids are hydrophobic. They do contain the same elements as carbohydrates, those being carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but in much different proportions. They have a lot of hydrocarbon and very little oxygen, therefore very little polarity, and they are hydrophobic. So they do not dissolve well in water and tend to aggregate together and minimize their exposure to the water. You see this whenever you cook and you put oil in the pot of water for your pasta or your rice or whatever you're cooking. You see that the water separates from the oil or the fat, and the fats tend to aggregate and sit on top of the water. So this diverse group includes your triglycerides, which include fats and oils, phospholipids, which are lipids that contain phosphorus and a phosphate group, steroids, and the fat-soluble vitamins, which are vitamins A, D, E, and K. Please note that. So let's look at each of these groups. This table summarizes the various types of lipids and their functions. Please go over it. Note that the fatty acids, which are parts of triglycerides and phospholipids, are used to synthesize these larger molecules, but can also be broken down to generate ATP. So the products of fatty acid catabolism can enter Krebs cycle and be reduced to the coenzymes, which are then used to make ATP. So they are a major source of energy for your body. And please note that fatty acids and their storage form triglycerides provide almost 2 times as much energy per gram compared to carbohydrates. So while carbohydrates are the preferred energy source for your cells and the almost exclusive energy source for red blood cells and neurons, lipids provide more energy with less of them, which is why it is so hard to burn or remove fats from your body. Once you store them, they're hard to lose because it takes a lot more exertion and metabolism to clear the fats compared to the carbohydrates. The triglycerides, which are made up of 3 fatty acid tails, are stored in adipose tissue throughout the body, where they provide protection, insulation, and act as a source of energy storage. I should also mention that there is adipose tissue in the cavities of the bones of adults. So that's another place that triglycerides and adipose tissue are stored as an energy reserve. Phospholipids are the major components of cell membranes. We'll talk about that in a bit. And then we have our third group of fats called the steroids. The main steroid is cholesterol, and from it we synthesize bile salts, vitamin D, cortisol hormones, and the sex hormones. So all of these are classified as steroid derivatives. Carotenes are precursors for vitamin A, and we acquire them as a vitamin in our food, necessary for good vision as well as an antioxidant. Vitamin E is another lipid-soluble vitamin, important for skin health and wound healing and development and function of the nervous system. and is another antioxidant. Vitamin K is fat soluble and is required for the synthesis of several blood clotting proteins in the liver. And being water insoluble or hydrophobic, lipids are transported in the blood surrounded by proteins which are hydrophilic. So the proteins surround and package with the lipids to make them transportable in the blood. Please note that the fat-soluble vitamins, vitamins A, E, D, and K, must be absorbed in your diet with other fats. So fats are not the enemy. You need fats in your diet for the functions we've mentioned here, but you also need fats to absorb your fat-soluble vitamins. Fats are also necessary for immunity. So let's go over to the fatty acids and we'll talk about that a bit. Fatty acids, or FAs, are long hydrocarbon chains that make up triglycerides and phospholipids. They are depicted below. So again, lots of carbon with hydrogen, very little oxygen. Fatty acids can be classified as saturated or unsaturated. Saturated fatty acids have carbons that are saturated with hydrogen and no double bonds. Because of that, these fats tend to be linear in shape and packed together very well. And because of that, they tend to be solid at room temperature and are called fats. Also note that saturated fats come primarily from animal foods. So the fat in milk and milk products or the fat from animal foods tend to be, such as meat, tend to be saturated fatty acids. Fatty acids that are saturated also increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. Unsaturated fatty acids, such as oleic acid, have one or more double bonds in the hydrocarbon chain. The double bond requires removal of one hydrogen from each carbon, so those carbons are no longer saturated. That's why they are called unsaturated fats. And the double bond creates a kink or a bend in the fatty acid chain. Because of this, the fats do not pack together as well as your saturated fats and tend to form more fluid or liquid states at room temperature. So your unsaturated fats are also called oils. And these come predominantly from plant foods. So we're talking about the fats that make up canola oil and sunflower oil and olive oil, vegetable oils in general. So they are liquid at room temperature. They are called oils. They have one or more double bond. And also note that unsaturated fats have been shown to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. There's a third type of fatty acid called trans fats. These are rare in nature, but they can be generated artificially by adding hydrogen across double bonds in unsaturated fats. This process is called hydrogenation. Unfortunately, it adds the hydrogens in an unnatural configuration. So instead of the hydrogens adding on the same or cis side of the carbons, they add on opposite sides of the trans configuration. And this has been shown to increase the risk of cardiovascular disease even more than consumption of saturated fats. So your healthiest fats are the unsaturated and polyunsaturated fats at that. Less healthy are the saturated fats, and the least healthy are the trans fats. So those are the bad fats in 2020. The fatty acids are attached to a glycerol backbone shown here in blue to make the triglycerides or phospholipids. So triglycerides are made up of a glycerol backbone to which is attached 3 fatty acid chains. These fatty acids can each be different. So here we have palmitic acid, stearic acid, and oleic acid. Please note that some fatty acids are considered essential fatty acids in that your body needs them. Your body cannot make them from other precursors, and therefore they must be present in your diet. Essential fatty acids include your omega-3 and your omega-6 fatty acids. Those are important for immune function and signaling in the body. So again, fats are not evil. It's about types and quantity. Fats in general, and particularly your triglycerides, should not represent more than 35% of your calories. But remember, you get more energy or calories per gram of fat than carbs, so you shouldn't have equal amounts of fat on your plate, but it should be much less if you're only looking at 35%, and you get a lot more energy per gram. So your fat should be very little in your diet. Where the triglycerides are stored, again, they provide protection, insulation, and a form of energy reserve. Phospholipids are the second group of lipids. Phospholipids are an important component of cell membranes, and that's because of their unique properties. Phospholipids have a similar structure to triglycerides in that there is a 3-carbon glycerol backbone to which is attached 2 fatty acid tails. But the 3rd carbon is attached to a phosphate group. This phosphate group contains very polar phosphorus, oxygen, and nitrogen. So this molecule has differing reactivities at different ends. The phosphate group is very polar and interacts well with water. It's hydrophilic, while the nonpolar hydrocarbon tails of the fatty acids are hydrophobic. So the polar head, made up of the phosphate group, interacts well with water, while the fatty acid tails repel water. This allows for a unique arrangement where polar heads can align with the tails away from a watery environment, and the fatty acid tails of one layer can orient themselves with the next layer or second layer where the phosphate heads are opposite to the tails, and this creates what's called the lipid bilayer that makes up the cell membrane. So the polar heads on one layer interact with the extracellular fluid, while the polar heads on the other end interact with the intracellular fluid, and the non-polar tails in the middle create a barrier that limits what passes in and out of the cell. The third class of lipids are the steroids. The steroids are very distinct from triglycerides and phospholipids in that there are no fatty acid tails. The molecules do contain hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, but they are arranged in hydrocarbon rings. The most common of the steroids is cholesterol, which we acquire from our diet, but also synthesized in the liver. Cholesterol is a steroid from which other steroids are derived, such as the hormones testosterone, estrogen, and cortisol. Vitamin D for calcium absorption is a derivative of cholesterol, as are bile salts for fat digestion and absorption. So, cholesterol is not all bad. You do need cholesterol in your diet. Cholesterol is also an important component of the plasma or cell membrane. However, too much cholesterol does increase the risk of cardiovascular disease as it becomes a component of the fatty plaques that make up atherosclerosis. Our third class of organic compounds are the proteins. Proteins are large molecules made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they are unique in that they contain nitrogen. And proteins are the main source of nitrogen in your body. Some proteins also contain sulfur, depending on the amino acids they contain. So the structural units for proteins are building blocks called amino acids. Amino acids are arranged in a head to tail orientation within a protein and are linked together by peptide covalent bonds. So when you hear the word peptide, think protein, especially short chain proteins with a few amino acids. We'll look at the structure on the next slide. Now, because proteins are the body's main source of nitrogen, watching or monitoring the clearance of nitrogen from the body and comparing it to the amount of nitrogen that is ingested in protein foods is a way to assess the health and state of an individual. And this is a phenomenon called nitrogen balance. Individuals that are healthy, who are not growing, but are maintaining health, where the rate of protein intake and buildup equals the rate of protein breakdown and loss in the urine and other ways, is said to be in nitrogen balance. Individuals who are growing, undergoing tissue repair, or during pregnancy are experiencing positive nitrogen balance because they are building up and using more proteins than they are breaking down. The opposite is true for those in negative nitrogen balance. Individuals who are ill, whose tissue is wasting away or is being broken down, or who are not ingesting enough proteins, are said to be in negative nitrogen balance. So think of your ill client, the cancer patient, someone that is experiencing extended fasting or malnutrition and not ingesting enough nitrogen. Their body will break down their protein stores while not balancing that with intake and buildup. So that individual is in negative nitrogen balance. Nitrogen appears in the urine as an ammonium waste, so that's how it can be tracked. So at the top we have a classic amino acid which contains a central carbon to which is attached an amino group at the head of the amino acid, that's where the nitrogen is, and a carboxyl group that makes up the tail. Each amino acid is unique in that it has a different R or reactive group. So at the bottom we have 2 of the 20 amino acids found in nature, glycine and alanine. They can be linked together through a dehydration synthesis reaction that creates a peptide bond. And now 2 amino acids linked together head to tail, well, tail to head, would be a dipeptide. Most proteins contain several amino acids linked together. The order of amino acids determines the arrangement of the hydrogen bonds that will form in this molecule, and the hydrogen bonds create unique folding patterns for the molecule. So the arrangement of the amino acids linearly creates what's called the primary structure of a protein, while the initial folds into either alpha helixes or beta sheets created by hydrogen bond interactions between different parts of the amino acid chain create the secondary structure for the protein. And when those secondary structures fold on themselves due to more hydrogen bonding, we get tertiary structures. And some proteins involve aggregates of more than one peptide chain, again held together by weak hydrogen bonds, and these now make up quaternary proteins, such as hemoglobin, which is a large protein made up of 4 individual peptide or protein chains. So since these hydrogen bonds are responsible for the secondary, tertiary, and even quaternary levels of structure of these proteins, proteins are very sensitive, again, to pH and temperature changes. Anything outside of the homeostatic range for these parameters can lead to denaturation of the proteins where they begin to unfold and lose their functional shape. So these hydrogen bonds, again, are critical for the proper folding and shape of the proteins, and the proper shape of the protein is required for the proper functioning of the proteins. Proteins are a major nutrient in your body and have several major roles. Some proteins are structural, such as the ones that make up the cytoskeleton, or the collagen fibers in your connective tissues and your bones, or the connective tissues that help to bind organs and separate them from each other. Proteins can be regulatory. We just talked about hemoglobin that helps to regulate pH. Hemoglobin also participates in transport of not only oxygen but also carbon dioxide. Other regulatory proteins include those that act as hormones, such as insulin, that regulates your blood glucose levels. Other proteins provide protection, physical protection, such as the proteins that make up your muscles or the proteins that make up your bones. Yes, bone contains proteins. We also have immune protection provided by immunoglobulins or antibody proteins and complement proteins. We have protection against blood loss with clotting proteins. Contraction is an important function for proteins. We have contractile proteins, myosin and actin, that interact to generate force and create movement. We mentioned proteins playing a role in transport, such as hemoglobin. Proteins, as we saw, also transport lipids and lipoproteins. Proteins transport iron and calcium and many other substances in the blood. And a major role of proteins is that all enzymes are proteins. And these are the proteins that carry out the reactions in your body. Without enzymes, reactions would occur too slowly and would not be conducive to life. Now, under extreme conditions of nutrient deprivation, so if an individual is not ingesting enough carbohydrates or lipids, the body can break down or use proteins as a source of energy by converting some amino acids into precursors for glucose synthesis. That requires removal of the amino group in a process called deamination. That amino group is then converted into a less toxic form called urea, which is then excreted from the body in the urine. But that is under extreme conditions of malnutrition or starvation. Okay, so protein shouldn't have to be used to make ATP. Proteins have other roles: structural, regulatory, protection, contraction, transport, and enzymatic. Keep that in mind. Quickly review these slides that show you how enzymes work if you're not familiar with that process. Let's finish up with a quick overview of the nucleic acids. DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, provides what's called the blueprint of life, because the code of the nucleotide bases in DNA are what determine the arrangement of amino acids during protein synthesis. And since proteins play so many roles in the cells, including enzymatic function, protein function determines cell function, and proteins are formed based on the DNA code. DNA is found within the nucleus of the cell, arranged in structures called chromosomes. The code for DNA is transcribed or copied into a molecule of RNA. So this has a ribose sugar as opposed to a deoxyribose sugar. And these molecules take the code from DNA and transport it out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm of the cell, where the organelle, the ribosome, reads the code and based on the code arranges the amino acids in the proper sequence for the protein encoded by a particular region on that DNA called a gene. RNA is similar to DNA in that it does have your adenine, guanine, and cytosine nucleotide bases, but the thymine in DNA is then replaced by uracil in RNA. There are different forms of RNA. I'm happy to tell you that we will not be going into the details of transcription and translation. So for now, just remember that DNA is the intermediary molecule between DNA and protein synthesis. Technically, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is also a nucleic acid because of its structure, but it is not involved in the coding for protein synthesis. ATP stores energy in the phosphate bonds, and that energy can be used to power reactions. When the phosphate is broken off of an ATP molecule and the energy is used, the remnant is called ADP, adenosine diphosphate. But then, during catabolic reactions, the energy from other molecules can be used to reattach phosphate to ADP to make new ATP molecules. So here's our DNA. Please note the double helix structure and how the two strands of DNA are held together by, oh, look at that, hydrogen bonds. So the structure of DNA, including the helix structure, again, is very sensitive to pH and temperature due to those weak hydrogen bonds. And here is our adenosine tri and diphosphates. Note the high energy bonds between the terminal phosphates that can be captured and used to power reactions.